Hello friends and welcome to Sustainable Prepping, your home for fear-free emergency preparedness and a sustainable life. My name is Brecky and today we are going to be talking about ways that you can be prepared for any potential fallout of the midterm elections here in the United States. If you are new, I want to say a great big welcome. I'm glad you found our slice of the internet. And if you're not new, I want to say welcome back. Together, we are building a place for progressives and liberals to talk about emergency preparedness from a place of independence and resilience rather than fear. If you want to support my channel, like this video, subscribe so you never miss my content, and friends, share this video with someone who you think will get something out of it. Send it to a friend, post it in a group, and you can also take a snapshot of this thumbnail and post it on your Instagram, tag me and let me know that this video was valuable to you. This is how we spread that fear-free message far and wide. I want to give you 5 ways that you can be prepared for the aftermath of the midterm elections here in the United States and their fallout, as it will impact most of North America and possibly parts of Europe. Yes, we have that kind of influence still as a major colonializing power, but it is important for us to think about this also broadly. As elections happen in any country, as we see currently with our neighbors down south in Brazil, there are going to continue to be election deniers, and we're going to continue to see right-wing fascist and authoritarian regimes trying to hold on to power and push against democratic ideals. That is happening in the United States. We are also seeing in the United States these right-wing organizations attacking private individuals as they push against democracy. The attack on Paul Pelosi and the Pelosi home is a perfect example. The fact that it was not uniformly and summarily condemned by the Republican Party shows that the acts of attacking private individuals who have any links or any relationship, real or perceived, to elected officials is acceptable. Now that we've seen that, we know that private individuals are not safe and would not be supported, nor would private homes, right? Private property, which theoretically is very important to conservatives, is not considered actually sacred if it means getting to that Democrat or that liberal or that progressive with whom you have a disagreement. This is a huge deal. Now, this is not going to be a conversation on immigration and the fact that it was a Canadian who did the attack, but we will need to emphasize that it was somebody who was radicalized online by right-wing rhetoric. These kinds of radicalized individuals are in all parts of our country, and some of them are running for office. There is an election denier in Wisconsin who has promised that if he is elected, he will ensure Republicans never win another election in Wisconsin. My friends, that is called a dictatorship. And the current Republican candidate for governor in Arizona has promised that she will not certify any elections in which Democrats win. Many Republicans are saying that if they don't win, they were going to call the elections frauds. In this mindset, there's no scenario in which your vote as a left-leaning person gets counted. If you don't vote Republican, your vote doesn't matter because they won't accept it. They are choosing to steal power in a fascist grab for dictatorial power and control. They're undermining the very values of democracy that they claim to support, and they're doing it from a completely brainwashed standpoint. Once you have somebody who's a true believer, a deeply, deeply ingrained true believer, they are willing to use violence and to confront individuals and property as recipients of their violence in order to prove their rhetoric and support their rhetoric. I first want to pause and say, if you are feeling anxious, as I mentioned, possible violence in response to the elections and the claims of the election being stolen, which are already being claimed. This video is being filmed on the Friday before the election, and we are already hearing Republicans say, well, if I don't win, it's a fraud. Because this is being touted, we have a much higher likelihood of violence in response by these radicalized individuals. I know that that might be scary, and you might be uncomfortable. You're coming to me for fear-free information, but I don't want us to put our head in the sand in order to avoid fear. Let's focus and plan ahead. And that's what I'm going to give you with these 5 tips. Now, my first tip is going to be one that I've actually already talked about and explained in depth in my preparation for the inauguration video, which I'm going to make sure is linked up in the cards. And that is to top off everything. Make sure you have enough water for a week. If you don't have that, top that off. Make sure your pantry, your working pantry, not your dedicated food storage, but the pantry that you use every day, make sure it's topped off. Have all the milk you need, the cereal you need, the snacks you need, some fresh fruits and veggies, some frozen fruits and veggies, a little bit of meat, whatever you need to go a week or 2 weeks without having to go to the grocery store. Have all of those things topped off. Have your meds topped off. If you're someone who only has 2 or 3 days left of a medication, see if you can get it early and get on that right now. You want to make sure that you don't have to leave home if for whatever reason there is violence, and that violence is either blocking streets or perhaps disrupting supply lines. You would be able to hunker down, shelter in place if you need to. So you need to have food, water, medicine, things like batteries in place in case we have any power outages, whether it come from storms or civil unrest. You want to be able to charge all your things and have your flashlights topped up and ready to go. You also want to have some cash on hand just in case you need to get out of Dodge, and you want to make sure your fuel is topped up. Keep your car fueled at above 3/4 of a tank if you can afford to do so, even if it means paying a little bit more for gas, so that should you need to make a quick escape, you aren't having to stop and get fuel in 30 minutes or an hour. You can get several hours away from the altercations happening because you have a full gas tank. So just like you might for a storm, prep and top off all of your basic needs, and do that, make that your top priority. The second recommendation is to have that evacuation plan. Now, an evacuation plan could mean moving from one part of a city to another that is likely to have less escalation of violence. If you know that there's a lot of civil unrest that happens in your region, you might just need to go a few streets over or a few neighborhoods over in order to avoid the violence. If that's the case, if you're worried about that, have that plan in place now. Have a couple of different scenarios and a place that knows you might be showing up if things get hot. You might also need to evacuate from your area completely, and you need to know where you're going and how you plan on getting there. I suggest that you print out a map if you aren't someone who knows the streets very well, particularly surface streets versus highways, because things could get blocked off. And you want to have a location that you can go and be safe, someplace that is out of the way. Usually it's a rural retreat, but it might not be in this scenario because we're talking about potentials for civil unrest. So think about that, have that plan in place, get that on lock now before Tuesday, just in case you live in an area that could be hot. And again, areas that could be hot are states like Arizona, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Georgia, Virginia, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. Not to mention places like Washington State and Montana that have paramilitary presences. So keep your ear to the ground, keep your eyes open, and if you feel like you live in an area that could be hot, have a plan to get out and go to a cooler area. My third recommendation is going to be to talk to your neighbors. Who's vulnerable? Are there elderly or people with lots of small children or someone with a disability of some kind that lives in your apartment or your neighborhood or your general area? Are there people who are going to need some support? Don't become the person that only cares about your family. Be the kind of person that preps ahead of time and encourages those vulnerable people to get those preps. If you know that there's an older person who can't go out and get their meds, offer to do that for them if it's legal. Go get a few extra groceries so they can stay home. You want to know that your area is going to be okay. And getting to know people and how prepped they are could also let you know who will be an ally if things do get hot. Who can you trust? Who do you want to trust? These are relationships that we should have already been building, but if you haven't started, now is a great time. Ask around, ask what people's plans are. You could even couch it in the terms of, there could be some winter storms. Who's prepped for that? Or you could say, hey, I've watched this random woman on the internet and she's a little concerned. What do you think? These are conversations that could start good and meaningful relationships. If things get hot and you're locked down, you would be glad to know who you can trust, who you might be able to pool resources with, and who might be able to help you secure your area if you need to do that. Relationships matter so much. So don't neglect cultivating local area relationships, and especially if you can find folks who are like-minded or who at least aren't radicalized. Those are people to know and to start connecting with. My fourth recommendation as we think about potential violence in the wake of the midterms is going to be plan to lay low. Don't plan in the next 2 to 4 weeks to be doing a lot of stuff in high density areas. I know that might mean stepping back from some of the things you planned on doing for the Thanksgiving holiday or shopping or hay rides and harvest festivals, but those are soft targets. They're easy for radicalized individuals to use as examples and to prove that they are real patriots and are taking out all of those fraudsters. If we look at places of violence, it is places like grocery stores that have high minority populations, places that are in progressive areas like gay nightclubs. It is just worth it to take a couple of weeks to lay low at home, maybe order your groceries if you can afford to do so, maybe cancel those plans to go out to dinner in a crowded area. Yes, I know it's inconvenient, and we don't want to live in fear because then terrorism wins. However, sometimes taking a little bit of precaution can take you a long way, and we want you to be safe, we want you to be secure, and we want you to be able to lead a community if there is a crisis. So really thinking about, can you limit how much public engagement you're doing, particularly in that first week or so right after the election results, and especially if there are contested elections in your area, or if you know that there is a paramilitary group that operates in your area, it might just be worth it to say, you know what, we're gonna pay the extra $10 for the next 2 weeks to get our groceries delivered just so we don't have to be in that crowded space. You know what, we were gonna go out to eat in this really public area, but we're going to do takeout. I know it's inconvenient and frustrating, but it could be important for safety. This is especially true if you live in a blue spot in a generally red area. If your area goes blue and there are people who are conservative who don't believe it is possible for it to have gone blue, and I'm thinking here of places like Georgia, North Carolina, Virginia, they could retaliate by trying to find those who are committing frauds and using violent tactics in order to pursue their ends. Now, I don't want you to live in fear. I don't want you to quake in fear and give up your life. But a week or two of lower public presence isn't going to disrupt your life and could keep you and your family safe. My fifth and final recommendation for responding to the midterms is to have backup communication systems. Now, I'm not necessarily recommending that you become a ham radio operator and get all of that gear right now. If you haven't already learned how to use a ham radio or a CB radio, you aren't going to learn in the course of 2 or 3 days. But it would be good for you to have a backup way of catching the news. So a weather radio, an old-fashioned radio that can pick up AM, FM, and the long wave frequencies that weather radio often is on. This way you can get updates even if the power is out, the internet or cable is cut, or you're just concerned about getting an alternative viewpoint. I say this because the electricity could go out as an act of sabotage, and controlling media is one of the first things a dictatorial regime is going to do. Just look at our neighbors in Russia and China. They get their news scrubbed, and there are whole topics that you can't even Google in those countries in order to keep the populace narrowly informed and controllable. They control the entire narrative, and if an area is somehow influenced or taken over by a right-wing authoritarian group, they're going to want to control what you can hear. Having an old school radio means you're going to be able to pick up on really long-range signals. These are very hard to control. So having that old-fashioned radio that can pick up those long wave frequencies means you're going to be able to get news from outside of your region. And this is important. If you are someone who's familiar with ham radio or CB radio, then making sure everything is up to date and you know how to use it and you know how to get in contact with family or friends would be a really great asset. But for a lot of us, we don't have time to learn those skills in 2 or 3 days. So just getting an old-fashioned long wave radio, a weather radio and the batteries, the backup batteries to keep it charged is a great way to have access to information coming in from the outside should, in the worst case scenario, you have acts of sabotage that prevent you from getting good quality news. At the end of the day, the point is to be as prepared for any major emergency. Having everything topped up is what you would do in the event of preparing for a storm or general preparedness. We're just heightening our alert level because an act of violence can happen anywhere, unfortunately. And the acts of violence that we have already begun to see, like the firebombing of a donut shop that hosted a drag show, right? These kinds of acts of violence are going to continue. Regardless of how the midterms go, they're going to continue because they are now seen as reasonable in the eyes of the right wing. The attack on Paul Pelosi changed the game. We were already heading that direction, but we have now passed the sign and the exit where we could have gotten off that ramp. If the majority of Republicans had overwhelmingly said attacks on individuals are unacceptable and this does not represent a rhetoric, we might have seen a change, but we didn't see that. We saw lots and lots of Republicans defending the action or simply saying that this is about immigration and not about right-wing conservative rhetoric. I don't know what's going to happen, but I want you to keep your eyes and ears open. If you're anxious, stay home. Have a plan to leave if you feel like your area is unsafe, and have your go bag ready. This is why we prepare in the event that the worst case scenario happens. I hope it doesn't, and I don't expect a second civil war to break out anytime soon. But I do think it's important to know, particularly if you live in a contested area, that there could be acts of violence, and being prepared for them is why we prepare. You can be ahead of that curve, and you can be able to respond to a crisis with calm and confidence, even if you feel anxious. Friends, down in the comments, let me know how you feel about the midterms and what you're going to be doing to respond to potential acts of violence. What are you going to be doing to be prepared, and what are you doing to keep peace of mind? I know that I have some anxiety myself, and living now in a more population dense area, not too far away from some very hyper conservative areas, I am anxious about retaliation from those who have been radicalized, just as any terrorist is radicalized. Make no mistake, these acts of violence are acts of domestic terrorism, and we do need to think about how we respond to them. But we can respond, and we can learn to push against them, and we can do our best to keep our family safe by being situationally aware and prepared in advance. I hope you all are well. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments. You can always find me on Instagram and Facebook. My info is down below. And as always, happy prepping.